This is like my favorite word.
I know. Go for it. I won't take it away from you.
I
Don't
love
worry.
saying it. So one of the big things is that around the time of ovulation, you can actually feel the ovulation occurring, and you get this oftentimes pelvic pain, oftentimes on one side, and it has this great name called Mittelschmerz.
Say it again.
Mittelschmerz.
She does love that word.
I do love it. But it's the perfect word for that weird random pain that you get on your lower pelvis when you know that ovulation time is coming. You can just scream out Mittelschmerz.
Hi, superhumans. I'm Dr. Mavis Garcia.
And I'm Dr. Wise.
We're two of the physician leaders at Markham Fertility Center, otherwise known as Our Baby, MFC.
As fertility specialists, we've witnessed firsthand the challenges, triumphs, and the myriad of emotions that come with trying to conceive. Whether you're just starting to think about having a baby, actively trying, or facing challenges along the way, My Fertility Podcast will be your go-to resource for honest conversations and a supportive community.
So grab a cup of coffee or tea and settle in, and let's demystify the world of fertility together. Hey, did you know that the average woman in Canada will have about 465 menstrual cycles in her life?
Wow, that's a lot.
Right? Thinking about how much of our life we spend on a menstrual cycle, we should really understand how the menstrual cycle can impact not only fertility, but a lot of different aspects of a woman's life.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, it can affect everything. If you have a better understanding of the menstrual cycle, it's a lot easier to be a bit more in tune with your body.
Absolutely. Like right now, I'm wearing scrubs because I'm bloated. Ask me why I'm bloated.
Why are you bloated?
I'm in the luteal phase of my cycle,
Oh.
and I cannot fit into my pants.
Listen, we've all been there. Don't worry. We're just very lucky that we've got scrubs in our closet as backups.
That's right.
So the menstrual cycle is really like the engine for all of fertility. And for all the ways that we can help someone get pregnant, we're constantly thinking about the menstrual cycle and constantly talking about the menstrual cycle in clinic. I'd say I think about it maybe 1,000,000 times a day.
The menstrual cycle refers to the choreographed dance of hormones coming from the brain, affecting the ovary, and the downstream effects of those hormones on the uterine lining, the egg maturation, and essentially, eventually, hopefully, a potential pregnancy.
So the average age of menarche in Canada is about 12 and a half years old. So menarche refers to when a woman will have her very first period. 12 and a half years old, it's actually getting a little bit earlier. So about 20 to 30 years ago, the average age was more like 13 years of age when a girl would have her very first period. And then 100 years ago, the average age was maybe like 13 and a half years when a woman would have her first period. Now, the exact reason is not really well understood, but we think it might be because we've got higher body fat percentage now and young people with ovaries due to our more modern diets as well.
That's right. So the average age of menarche has gone down, as Dr. Weiss indicated. The average age of menopause hasn't really changed, and it is still about 51 years of age. The definition of menopause is when you haven't had a period for a year. And it's a bit of a difficult definition because you can only make it after a year of no periods. So it's not very helpful. It's more helpful, I think, to talk about perimenopause, which is this period prior to menopause that can last anywhere between 4 to 8 years.
People will often ask, like, how do I know if I'm in perimenopause? Like, what's your answer for that?
Well, we don't really know if you're in perimenopause until you've made it to menopause. But usually, if women are having irregular cycles, if women are of that age group in the sort of the 45 to 50 years of age, those are the indications that it could be related to perimenopause.
Yeah, that's definitely a big one. I think those first symptoms of menstrual cycles becoming irregular, skipping periods, those are the symptoms that we usually will see.
So I think it would be really important to talk about what is a normal menstrual cycle, right? So we went back to the SOGC guidelines as the Society of Obstetrician and Gynecologists of Canada to look at these statistics. A normal menstrual cycle can vary between 24 and 38 days.
And you can have a normal variation in cycling. It can be anywhere from 2 to 20 days, actually, and still be considered normal.
And the period of bleeding should be between 3 and 8 days with an average blood loss of 80 to 85 cc's per cycle, although, like, who really measures how much blood you lose in a cycle? Makes no sense.
I don't know, maybe if you're using one of the cups. you'll have a better
It's
idea.
true.
Yeah.
It is more useful to talk about how many times you will change pads or tampons. So usually every 3 hours intervals will be normal. If you have to change your pads or your tampons because you're soaked every hour, then that is too much bleeding.
And generally, you should be able to use fewer than 21 pads or tampons per cycle. But of course, it really will depend on how often somebody chooses to change these things, or if they're using more than one at the same time.
It would be unusual to have to wake up in the middle of the night multiple times a night to change a pad or a tampon. So if that is happening, again, this would be considered abnormal bleeding.
And blood clots are normal.
Yes.
Yes, but that's a big point. I get that question a lot. So it's very, very normal to have blood clots. Blood clots? I always thought it's kind of a good thing because it means that your blood clotting system is working and that the blood that's there is clotting appropriately. But you shouldn't have really big blood clots. So anything over an inch in diameter is pretty unusual.
And certainly having a menstrual cycle should not make you anemic.
Yes, that's another big one.
The other one is pain during a menstrual cycle. So having a bit of cramps is normal. The uterus is contracting to trying to pass out blood. But being double over in pain, not being able to go to work or go to school, having to take multiple pain medications throughout the day, having to take narcotics, that is not normal. And it's something that should be addressed by a gynecologist.
Yeah, absolutely. So this is kind of a fun one. When we were doing some research on the episode, some common menstruation myths. And even when we were chatting about this, we have heard very different ones growing up as well.
That's right.
Because we grew up in very different countries, right? So I think one of the big ones that I always heard is that you can't swim during your period.
I've definitely heard that too, which is not true.
You can absolutely swim during your period. Nothing bad will happen. I mean, I think most people would use a tampon and it's absolutely fine. And if anything, actually exercise would be really helpful because it can help release some of the endorphins and help relax some of the muscles too to help with cramping.
Which brings me back to the other menstrual myth, which is you cannot exercise during your period, which is also completely not true. Although I did use it to get out of health class a few times when I was growing up.
That's okay. I think we all do.
Oops. Sorry, teacher from 20 years ago. So definitely it is perfectly fine to exercise during your period. As a matter of fact, yes, there have been studies to show that it decreases the amount of PMS symptoms or menstrual cramps that you have when you exercise routinely.
Another one that we kind of touched on is about using tampons if you're a virgin. Did you ever hear that one? You can't use a tampon
I've heard
if you're
that
a virgin.
one. Yeah, absolutely not true. Being a virgin, I mean, we can get into
Well, that's a whole other
being.
kettle of fish.
It's a bit of a social construct. It really refers to having a hymen. And a hymen is a little layer that is on the outside of the introitus, which is the entrance to the vagina. And that layer can be broken for multiple reasons. Riding a bike or just growing up and having estrogen production can just make that layer go away without you even noticing. So the whole concept of having a hymen is very obsolete. There are many girls who've never had any sexual activity that don't have an intact hymen, and that is completely normal. You can put a tampon into the vagina, whether or not you've been sexually active in the past or not.
Any other good myths that you've heard?
Oh my goodness. Growing up in Cuba, I've heard, you can't wash your hair when you're on your period. You die.
I would feel like I can't go a week without washing my hair.
It's definitely not true.
Not with my hair texture. Like, it's just not going to happen.
Or you can walk around barefoot in the house if you're on your period, because that's really bad for you.
Okay, what's that?
I don't know. Okay. I don't know. I'm not saying it's true, but those are some of the things that I've heard growing up.
Suffice to say, there's a lot of myths out there around menstruation and lots of very different and creative myths around that.
I think menstruation has always had a bit of religious or cultural connotation.
Totally.
It's considered to be dirty, and, women need to be different or act differently or be somewhat isolated or when they're on their periods. And of course, I'm not here to criticize any culture or anything like that, but it's important to separate facts from cultural norms.
Yeah, absolutely.
So back to the menstrual cycle. The first thing that we're going to do is going to introduce the main protagonists of the story of the menstrual cycle. The actors and actresses, actually actresses, really.
Of course, they're all actresses,
Yes. So the first one is estrogen. Estrogen is the hormone produced by the ovaries as the eggs mature, and it makes the lining of the uterus thicken in preparation for potential pregnancy.
Then we've also got two other important hormones, FSH and LH. So FSH stands for follicle stimulating hormone, LH luteinizing hormone. So these are hormones produced by the pituitary gland, which is like a gland in your brain, and they circulate around the whole body in the bloodstream, and then they're the ones that act on the ovary. So they're like the director that tells the ovary to make more estrogen and to grow an egg, for instance.
And then there is progesterone. Progesterone is the one that comes at the final act. Progesterone is made by the ovaries after ovulation. It dominates the second half of the menstrual cycle. It is the hormone that supports a pregnancy if a pregnancy were to happen. And when a pregnancy doesn't happen, it is the drop in progesterone that causes the onset of menstruation.
And it's important to know that in pregnancy, when we see that progesterone will rise even more, and then that's the placenta that will take over, creating that progesterone and that super, super crucial hormone for pregnancy.
So now that we know about estrogen, progesterone, FSH, and LH, we're going to start talking about how they all play together in different phases of the menstrual cycle.
One thing that's really important to know is that when we talk about the menstrual cycle, we're talking about the first day of full flow to the next first day of full flow. And that we, by convention, we sort of call day one of the menstrual cycle the first day of full flow of the period.
A lot of people think it's the first day that they're not bleeding. But that's not correct. It's the first day of full flow.
Yeah.
So super, super important to understand that.
So the first part of the menstrual cycle is menstruation, right? So the cycle begins with menstruation. We talk about it as the period. And this is the thing that goes on for those 3 to 8 days where you have the bleeding. So the bleeding is the lining of the uterus that gets built up through the cycle and is now being shed. So it gets built up in the previous cycle and now it's coming out because it's being shed by the uterus. And the uterus is contracting essentially to push it out. And that's why you get menstrual cramping. This is a total normal and healthy process. And the amount and duration can definitely vary from person to person.
Following menstruation, we have the follicular growth, the follicular phase of the menstrual cycle. This is the phase that usually lasts between, I would say usually about 10 to 14 days, but it can last anywhere between 7 to 21 days at the extremes. And it involves the development of the follicles in the ovaries. The follicles is what contains, at this point, an immature egg, and eventually that follicle will grow and contain a mature egg that will release during ovulation. As the follicles grow, they produce estrogen, and estrogen stimulates the thickening of the uterine lining in preparation for a potential pregnancy.
Then we've got ovulation. Ovulation is a really, really important moment in the menstrual cycle, which is typically around the middle of the cycle if somebody has a 28-day cycle. Or you can think about it as happening about 14 days before the start of the next menstruation. So during ovulation, we get a big rise, a big spike in that LH hormone that comes from the brain, and it causes a mature egg to be released from one of the follicles. And it's kind of wild because you see this follicle and it literally like bursts open, and then the egg kind of comes out into the pelvis and it gets picked up by the fimbriated end of the fallopian tube, those little fingers on the fallopian tube. And then it starts traveling down the fallopian tube, and that's where it's looking for that sperm, hoping to get fertilized by a sperm that's in there. And so, the exact trigger, the exact mechanism of why we get this LH jump is not really super well understood, but we know that rising estrogen levels are really important. And that's one of the things that triggers this big LH jump.
Absolutely. So after ovulation comes the luteal phase. The luteal phase lasts about 14 days. Now, remember how I told you the follicular phase can be very variable and last anywhere between 7 to 21 days? Well, it is interesting to know that where the follicular phase can be variable, the luteal phase is constant, and it's usually about 14 days. So if you have a cycle that is very long, for example, 35 days long, it's because the follicular phase lasted a long time, but the luteal phase was still 14 days. So the ruptured follicle transforms into a structure called the corpus luteum. And this corpus luteum is what produces the superstar of the luteal phase, which is the hormone progesterone. Progesterone helps maintain the uterine lining if there was a fertilized egg and prepares the body for pregnancy. If fertilization did not occur, and if there is, or implantation did not occur and there is no pregnancy, then the corpus luteum breaks down, leading to a decrease in estrogen and progesterone levels, which leads to the onset of menstruation.
And then it all starts over again, right from the beginning, back to menstruation.
That's right. So to summarize, the menstrual cycle has two phases, the follicular phase and the luteal phase. The first half of the cycle is the follicular phase, which is the growth of the follicle in preparation for ovulation. And the predominant hormone, the superstar of the follicular phase, is estrogen.
And the second half of the cycle occurs after ovulation, and it's called the luteal phase. And during this time, progesterone is the really predominant hormone. And so because these different halves of the cycle are characterized by really different hormones, they can lead to lots of different symptoms and feelings and all sorts of things. It's really, really important, though, to mention that if somebody's on a birth control pill or has a hormonal IUD or Depo-Provera or any other type of hormonal medications involving, estrogen and progesterone, this will affect their menstrual cycle, and that they may not even have a menstrual cycle in the way that we're talking about it. So for instance, a birth control pill probably is not ovulating. That's how a birth control pill works. Now, you might still have the monthly menstruation, that monthly bleeding, but it's not the same kind of menstrual cycle that we talk about when we're talking about what we just mentioned with ovulation and the follicular phase and the luteal phase. And so some of the symptoms and all these other things aren't necessarily pertinent either. And that's sort of how the birth control pill works, by suppressing things so that you don't get pregnant.
So I think it's important, actually, at this point, now that you mentioned using the birth control pill, it's important to understand what is the difference between not having a period at all when you're taking the birth control pill continuously and not having a period at all where you're not taking any form of contraception.
Yeah, absolutely. So if you're somebody who has a very irregular period, a period every 2 months, 3 months, not having a period at all, and you're not on any kind of hormonal medications, then that would be a really good reason to see your doctor, because what we know is that having the menstrual cycle causes the lining of the uterus to shed when you've got that bleeding. And when the lining is not being shed regularly and it's not being taken care of by hormones, being managed by some sort of hormonal medication, it can build up. And so that when you do get a period, they can be incredibly long, month-long periods, or they can be incredibly heavy where people end up in the emergency room because they're having super, super heavy bleeding. And then over even longer periods of time, the lining can become irregular. It can even become precancerous or cancerous. So it is important to make sure that the lining is being shed when it's growing unchecked by anything. And so that's why it is important to sort of keep an eye on a menstrual cycle and to make sure that there is some sort of bleed happening when you're not on any kind of hormones.
That's right. And it's important to understand that this isn't being a situation like you're saying. The lining is not being checked by anything. You're not having the regular amount of hormones because you're not having a regular menstrual cycle. Women who are taking the birth control pill regularly, they are receiving their estrogen and progesterone in the birth control pill. So the lining is not growing unchecked. Therefore, there is really no need to have a withdrawal bleed with the birth control pill. It is perfectly safe to take it continuously and not have a period at all, as long as you're taking those hormones regularly and therefore not having this unchecked stimulation of the endometrial lining.
And in fact, that's why a lot of women who are on the birth control pill, even if they, are having like a hormone-free period, when they're going to have their bleed, might even have any bleeding. It's probably because their lining was so thin to start with. There's nothing there to shed because the hormones are doing what they need to do. And so that's totally fine.
Yeah, absolutely. All right. So now that we've mentioned that, let's talk about the different symptoms that you may experience during the follicular phase and the luteal phase, because this is very cool.
Yeah, this is actually really fun. And I have to admit, some of these I had not even heard of until I found them, but I thought it was kind of cool. So first up, we've got the follicular phase. So again, this is the phase where your menstruation is done and your ovaries are growing that follicle to get towards that ovulation phase. One of the things that they talk about in the follicular phase is that women may experience increased energy levels.
I totally experienced that. Yeah, my workouts are awesome in the follicular phase. I feel like it's Superwoman.
Yeah, I think so, for sure. More energy in the follicular phase. Yeah, I agree.
Another one is improved mood. So many individuals report a more positive mood, increased motivation during the follicular phase as well.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, I experienced that too. There is less bloating. So as menstruation concludes, the water retention decreases and leading to reduced bloating and a feeling of being light and happy.
Oh yeah, 100%. This one for sure. I always feel like I'm so much better in everything. Yeah.
The high estrogen also correlate with increased libido, and that is mostly towards the later follicular phase. So the early follicular phase would be about day 4 to 6 of the cycle, and the later follicular phase would be a more day 10 to 14. So definitely increase libido during that time.
And it totally makes sense.
That's right.
Right? In terms of, if ovulation is coming, your body's going to want you to be having more intercourse so you can increase your chances of pregnancy.
Absolutely. There's also improved concentration. So people notice that there is cognitive function and mental clarity is improved during the follicular phase. I think so. I've noticed that too.
That one I'm not sure about if I've ever noticed that one.
Yeah. I find that especially writing these episodes and blogs and all the things that I do that require a lot of mental energy, I find them easier to do.
Oh, interesting.
When I'm follicular.
Another big one that people talk about sometimes is lower stress levels in the follicular phase.
I don't know about that. I think I'm stressed all the time.
Yeah. I'm not sure about that one.
Exercise performance, I already mentioned, definitely something that I've noticed. Have you noticed that too? Or you're just a superstar all the time?
No, I don't know about that. I think it's just that when I'm more stressed, I exercise better. So I think maybe that counteracts.
I see. There's a lot of people that actually are saying that, during the follicular phase, women should be doing more strength training and lifting heavy weights. And then during the luteal phase, they should be doing more things like yoga or mobility training. I don't know about that. I try to do everything I can whenever I can, but something to be said for that. It kind of makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. But I think it's important to know that there's nothing harmful with doing strength training in the luteal phase. It's just that you may not
feel like
hitting your personal best in the luteal phase, and that's okay, right? There is always going to be that variability.
That's
but
right.
It's not that you can only do yoga in the luteal phase or something like that.
That's right. Skin radiance and thicker hair. I don't think I've experienced that.
No,
I don't notice
not.
a difference. I don't
understand how you could have thicker hair for 2 weeks of every cycle. That seems like, I don't know, that seems a bit odd to me.
This was for sure. Optimism and sociability. Higher estrogen levels are associated with increased sociability and a generally more optimistic outlook in life. Yeah. I'm generally an introvert.
Really?
I'm always an introvert. Yeah, you didn't know that?
You're so social and outgoing, though.
Really? No,
Yeah.
I'm a big time introvert. But I could be more social and outgoing in the follicular phase for sure. There is also more lubrication and vaginal comfort in the follicular phase, which makes sense because estrogen contributes to vaginal lubrication that can enhance comfort during sexual activity.
For sure. Now, talking about ovulation, so the time around ovulation. Now, this is like my favorite word.
I know. Go for it. I won't take it away from you. Don't worry.
I love saying it. So one of the big things is that around the time of ovulation, you can actually feel the ovulation occurring. And you get this oftentimes pelvic pain, oftentimes on one side. And it has this great name called Mittelschmerz.
Say it again.
Mittelschmerz.
Like, does love that word.
I do love it. But it's the perfect word for that weird random pain that you get on your lower pelvis when you know that ovulation time is coming. You can just scream out Mittelschmerz. And you're going to sound super smart.
During ovulation, there is also changes in the cervical mucus. The consistency and color of the cervical mucus may change during ovulation. It becomes more clear, slippery, and more stretchy, kind of resembling egg whites. This facilitates sperm movement through the cervix into the uterus and eventually the fallopian tubes where it meets with the egg.
I find that some people are more aware of their cervical mucus, some people less so. It probably varies a lot person to person in terms of how much it even varies between the different phases. Yeah,
that's right. And just if you're not noticing a change in cervical mucus, it doesn't mean that you have a problem or that you're not going to be able to get pregnant or that something is wrong. There are other ways to test or know whether you're ovulating. Cervical mucus is only one of them.
Yeah. And speaking of which, basal body temperature. So this was another really popular way that people used to track when their ovulation was happening before we had, ovulation predictor kits and stuff like that. And so this idea is that your body temperature will increase slightly after ovulation because the progesterone, and that if you have a specific type of thermometer and you're measuring at a very specific time of day, so very first thing in the morning before you move, that you could sometimes catch that increase in body temperature. The only problem is that it increases after you ovulate.
That's right.
So if you're waiting for the increase in the body temperature and then trying to conceive, you've kind of missed the boat, unfortunately.
That's right. Yeah. But it can at least tell you that you did ovulate that cycle.
Yeah.
And it can help you predict when ovulation is happening in the next cycle if your cycles are regular.
Yeah.
We had already talked about increased libido, which makes sense with its surge in estrogen. There's also breast tenderness and my favorite, abdominal bloating.
Yes, the bloating is real.
For sure.
It's absolutely astonishing how much it can lead to going up the size in your pants, for sure.
Absolutely. Some people experience a heightened sense of smell or touch during ovulation as well. Ovulation pain.
Middle schmerz.
Middle schmerz. It's also very common during ovulation and mood changes.
For sure. And then spotting. This is a really common question.
Yes.
I think a lot of people get really worried about this. But because with ovulation, there is this drop in estrogen that occurs, it is normal to have spotting around the time of ovulation. Again, it does not affect the lining, does not affect your chances of pregnancy if you're having a bit of spotting.
Absolutely. Yes, people do worry about that quite a bit.
Yeah.
So now luteal phase symptoms. I find this very dramatic. I have very dramatic luteal phases, okay? That's my story and I'm sticking to it.
Yeah, fair enough. So that luteal phase, we're talking about the second part of the menstrual cycle where, it's progesterone is really that predominant hormone. And so a lot of these symptoms are really progesterone driven. Big one, bloating, as we talked about.
Big time.
Yeah, for sure.
Fatigue, for sure. That's the bigger one for me. All kidding aside, I just get so tired during the luteal phase. And that's why my workouts are not as great because I just feel like I'm walking through mud and I just can't move as fast.
Yeah, for sure. And one that I always get surprised by, even though it happens to me every cycle, the mood swings.
Yeah.
I will admit, I will find myself crying about something about 2 days before my period's supposed to come in. And yet I'm still always surprised that my period comes 2 days later. You think I would learn, but not yet. Not yet.
Some people can experience acne and skin changes as well in the luteal phase of the menstrual cycle. Yeah. And that has to do with, again, progesterone and the effect of oil production in the skin.
Yeah. What about food cravings? Do you ever find you have specific cravings in the luteal phase?
I get very hungry during the luteal phase. But I don't know that I crave something specifically, other than all the food in the world.
Fair enough. Just increased appetite in general?
Yes.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. But I always wonder whether that's also just like fatigue too, right?
Yeah.
I don't know. Yeah.
Some people have sleep disturbances as well, either difficulty falling asleep or staying asleep during the luteal phase, and increased sensitivity to things like light, sound, or smell. I don't experience either one of these last two, but I've heard of other people saying that for sure.
Yeah, I can't say increased sensitivity, or I don't find any sleep changes.
Me neither.
But I will get headaches for sure in my luteal phase. Yeah, which can sometimes just because of different hormones, that sometimes people will get headaches. I've definitely had that before.
So I hope that you found that useful. In the fourth episode, we are going to talk about how this all plays into pregnancy and how do you know when it's the best time to time intercourse within the menstrual cycle to achieve a pregnancy.
And it's going to be a great episode. And that's a wrap for today, Superhumans.
If you're looking to connect, get social with us. Follow us on YouTube and Instagram at My Fertility Podcast or visit us online at myconfertility.com. And don't forget, follow, subscribe, and share your favorite episodes.
Thanks for listening to My Fertility Podcast and for being a vital part of our community. We know you've got this.
We're signing off until next Tuesday.
If you found this episode of My Fertility Podcast helpful, please take a moment to head over to the review section and leave us your thoughts. Your reviews and comments are incredibly valuable to us and help guide future episodes. We also welcome you to direct your questions to info@myfertilitypodcast.com.
My Fertility Podcast is produced by Rabbit Media Inc. in conjunction with Dr. Garcia and Dr. Weiss. Music from Mix Kit Raising Me Higher by Ajay Stelino. My Fertility Podcast is not intended to replace any type or variation thereof professional medical, health, or legal advice, nor should the content be taken as medical advice. Please contact your primary healthcare professional regarding any medical questions you may have. The information presented in this podcast is based on the knowledge and understanding of the host at the time of recording. Medical knowledge is constantly evolving, and new research may change the understanding of health-related topics. While we strive to provide accurate and up-to-date information, we do not guarantee the completeness, accuracy, or timeliness of the content. The views expressed in this podcast by guests are not those of the host or the management. This podcast is not intended to impose any type of discrimination. My Fertility Podcast and its management are not responsible for any losses, damages, or liabilities that may arise from the use of this podcast.